Jesus wept. It's the shortest verse in the Bible, but oh, what a punch it packs. When I read the story of Jesus raising Lazarus and come to these words, I find I need to pause, to just stop here for a minute and ponder. Jesus wept. He wept. Now, there's more to these two small words than may initially think. In the Bible school and seminary, the verses are trotted out to prove that Jesus is fully human, that he experienced human emotions, almost as if God doesn't experience emotions. But here we see Jesus, fully God and fully man, weeping before the tomb of Lazarus. Jesus wept, and that means God wept, and that is profound and provocative. You know, when Bartley asked me to preach, I was both excited at the prospect of having a chance to share a gift to my home church, but I was also a little bit concerned because we were going to be flying home from California the day before, and if our trip out to California was any indication, we were 7 hours delayed in Denver airport. But when he told me the passage was 3 chapters long, I laughed. I said, "You've got to be kidding, 3 chapters?" But then I read it. And it was as if something just jumped right off the pages, for there's something here that I really believe that God wants me to share, and it jumped right out at me, and I hope to be able to share with you today. That something is, if you will, it's a paradigm of ministry. It's how Jesus invites us as his followers to engage our world, to follow him in his ways. And it all starts right here with Jesus weeping before the tomb of Lazarus. Jesus wept. Now, there's so many incredible details in this passage. I wish I had the time to point them all out to you, but we've only got a short period of time. It would be a blast to open up the passage and do a deep Bible study together. But given the time frame we have, I'd like to just simply focus on a few things before we really dig deep into the passage. So some quick observations. Number 1, Jesus clearly intended to raise Lazarus from the dead. And that was his plan from the very beginning. And just keep this in mind as you look at the passage. Number 2, Jesus could not have gotten back before Lazarus passed away. It was a 4-day journey from where he was to Bethany. And the news came to Jesus 2 days later, Lazarus has passed away. So he could not have gotten there. Third, Jesus delayed his departure so that there would be no doubt as to the fact that he raised Lazarus from the dead. Since he's not going to be able to be there before he died to prevent the death, by delaying 2 days, Jesus made sure that no one could be mistaken. No one could think it was staged, that it was some sort of hocus pocus or sorcery. As Martha would say to him, "Lord, there's a stink that would be here. There'd be an unmistakable odor of decay." The miracle, his final sign, would be unmistakable. There'd be no other answer to the resurrection of Lazarus than the fact that Jesus had authority over life itself. He was, as he would claim, to be the resurrection and the life. And then 4, Jesus shows us just how much God cares about suffering. You know, John uses surprisingly strong language to describe Jesus' emotion. And we'll dig into this in a bit, but just let it sink in. Jesus knew what he was going to do, and he was intentional in his timing. Yet, when he comes to that very moment, standing before the tomb of Lazarus, he acted in a manner reflecting his intimacy and his passion. He weeps. I mentioned already that it's somewhat ironic that this passage would be used by seminary and Bible school professors to point to the humanity of Jesus, that he felt human emotions. What it really points to is the fact that Jesus displays the same emotions as Yahweh. You know, many people envision God as being some sort of unmoved mover. Yet over and over again in the passages of Scripture, we find God interacting with humanity, engaging with us, wrestling with us, and experiencing profound emotional responses at us. From Abraham to Moses to David to the prophets, we find God as a God who grieves. He anguishes. He journeys with us and experiences our responses to him and our suffering, and he experiences it acutely. He is not remote. He is at hand. and he weeps. Our God weeps. Now, I mentioned that the words John uses are quite strong. Look at verse 33. When Jesus saw the weeping and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. Now, the first word that John uses is normally used for seething rage and indignation at something, outrage. This is no small disturbance. It's something felt so strongly and so deeply, like a weight or a pressure on your chest, an almost suffocating feeling that simply can't be expressed with words. Anger. The second word speaks of an inner turmoil, that unsettling feeling you have approaching things that cause anxiety. A huge exam, a performance appraisal with your boss, facing your parents or your spouse when you know you've disappointed them, an unexpected appointment with a doctor after you've had a repeat medical test. In John 12:27, Jesus uses that same word to speak of his own anguish as he anticipated heading to the cross. The suffering required to win our freedom was going to be profound. And once again in chapter 13, having washed the disciples' feet, John uses this word to describe Jesus' emotional state at the prospect of Judas betraying him and his crucifixion. Now, there's a lot of debate around what it was that caused Jesus to react so strongly. Some have suggested that he was angry at the unbelief of the people around him. But I don't see that, either here or in the other two passages where the words are found. Now, yes, at the end of chapter 12, we see John citing the words from Isaiah that point to people disbelieving that this was a fulfillment of prophecy. But in these immediate verses here in John chapter 11, we find anything but unbelief. Look first at verse 21 and 22. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." That's pretty powerful statement of faith. She's virtually asking Jesus to do the very thing he came to do, to raise her brother from the dead. And in response, we find that she proclaims to Jesus an incredible statement of faith. Jesus says to her, "I am the resurrection and the life," and we'll come back to that. And then she says to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe you're the Christ, the coming Messiah." It's the same words that Peter would use in the other Gospels to proclaim his faith in Jesus. What a profound statement. Faith is pulsating through this exchange. Now, look at verse 32. And notice the words of Mary are exactly the same as Martha. "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died." Faith is all over the passage. Even the Jews commenting in verse 36 repeat the same confidence that Martha had expressed that Jesus could have, in fact, prevented Lazarus dying. So, if it's not unbelief that troubles Jesus and ultimately brings him to tears, what is it that moves him so deeply? And I suggest to you that it's precisely the suffering of the people around him. His anger is focused on death itself. Reflecting on the implications of Jesus' own resurrection, Paul writes in 1 Corinthians, and he says this, that Jesus must reign until he puts all his enemies under his feet, and the last enemy to be destroyed is death. And here in John 11, we find Jesus standing before people suffering because of death. Jesus was face to face with death and what it does to people. It rips apart families. It hollows out the soul. It's the direct result of sin. It is his enemy. And faced with the carnage that enemy brings, Jesus didn't just sigh heavily. He didn't just groan. He was indignant. He was seething. He was steaming. He was furious. And then seeing the pain of the people around him, Jesus entered into their sorrow. He wept. The Jews commented in verse 36, "See how he loves him." Jesus wept. And then he rose Lazarus from the dead. He wept and then he acted. Now, Perhaps you may feel like Mary and Martha. Perhaps you've experienced a profound loss and cannot fathom why. I mean, where was God? Could he not have helped? Could he not have intervened? And all those people who blithely recite Romans 8, you're going to slug the next person who tells you that God's going to work out good in your situation. You're suffering deeply, and the pain is real, the grief profound. Perhaps you've lost a loved one before her time. Perhaps you were downsized by your company. You can't find employment. You've been betrayed, and you wonder, where's God? My friends, Jesus joins you in your suffering and seeing your pain and brokenness and of the world that causes this pain. He shares your sorrow. This is the God we follow. This is the God we serve, and in whose name and in whose image we are called to serve. He shares your indignation at injustice and the weight of your suffering and pain, and he weeps. He joins you in your suffering. He sits beside you and cradles you in his arms as you pour out your soul to him. He weeps, and then he whispers in your ear, "My son, my daughter, I am the resurrection and the life. I raised Lazarus from the dead. I rose from the dead, the first one to rise, never to die again, and I will raise your loved one when you return." And if God can raise people from the dead, surely he can resurrect your dream. Surely he can resurrect your future. I mean, you may feel like you've fallen too far or done too much or have too little to offer. You may feel that the actions of others have so ruined your life and your prospects. What hope do you have against this system? But Jesus is here, whispering life to you. He is the resurrection and the life. So here in chapter 11, we see Jesus in action. He weeps and then he acts. That's his paradigm for ministry. And we see it again in chapter 13. Now, in John chapter 13, this is a passage that's well known here at Renew. We reflect on it every time that we celebrate communion together. The trifold tradition of the love feast, the bread and the cup, and the washing of feet. There's not much that I could say that hasn't already been taught and pointed out here. But there's just two observations I'd like to highlight. First, look at how John starts the chapter, how he introduces it. He says this, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Or as some have suggested, the passage should be translated, he showed the full extent of his love. Now, if there's one thing that marked out the ministry of Jesus, it was his love. He talks about it in chapter 15 when he says, greater love has no one than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. And Jesus would indeed lay down his life for us. John again points to this indelible mark on Jesus' life, his love. In the first epistle of John, he looks for a way to define love. I mean, how do you define love? According to John, you need look no further than Jesus. In 1 John 3:16, he says, this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and so we ought to lay our lives down for our brothers and sisters. So the first thing we see in John 13 is that Jesus was driven to wash the disciples' feet by his love for them, a self-sacrificial love that knew no bounds and would ultimately lead him to the cross. Now, the second thing I want you to notice is just very simple. Judas, the man who would betray Jesus, was there. Jesus washed his feet too. Now, putting it all together, Jesus didn't wash the feet of the disciples because they deserved it. I mean, he didn't wait for Judas to leave before donning the towel. He did not wash their feet because he was somehow frustrated with their intransigence. He didn't wash their feet out of exasperation. He did not wash their feet to cleanse the room of the smell that would come from their feet and maybe cause indigestion during dinner. No, he got up, he washed their feet because he loved them, all of them. So in chapter 11, we see Jesus weeping and then acting. In chapter 13, we see Jesus loving and then serving. This is his paradigm for service. And to make it crystal clear, let's go back to chapter 12, because it's here that we find the link that ties these chapters together. Now, once again, there's so much in this chapter that we could spend hours looking at it. But we're just going to have to focus our thoughts on a few words of Jesus in the middle of this text. Words that are, if you will, the fulcrum of our text today. Starting at verse 23, Jesus says this: "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly, truly, I say to you that unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Whoever loves his life will lose it. Whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. If anyone serves me, he must follow me. And where I am, there my servant will be also. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him." Now, these same words are found in each and every gospel. And Jesus calls on all of us. If you wish to be named with him, you must follow him. And John says, as you see it here, you must go where he goes. Well, where is Jesus? Now, the other gospels make it clear, and John only hints at it. That's John's practice. He wants you to think and to contemplate. Where did Jesus go? And how did he get there? Well, there's really only one answer. Jesus sacrificed his life in every aspect of the word and suffered death. And not just any death. Death on a cross. Now, remember back to the astonishing claim of Jesus responding to Martha? He said, "I am the resurrection and the life." Now notice this clearly. Jesus didn't just say, "I'm the life." He said, "I am the resurrection and the life." And that is significant. You remember back to last week's passage, Jesus made an amazing claim that Andrew touched on. Jesus said in John 10, verse 10, "I have come that they may have life and have it to the full," or if you will, have it abundantly. I suggest to you that the fullness of life that Jesus promises is precisely this. It is resurrection life. And the ministry that Jesus calls us to not only points to the resurrection life found in Jesus, it also requires resurrection life to be pulsating and active within you and me. To follow Jesus then, and to experience the life he has to give, we must walk the same gauntlet. We must face down death. Death to our lives, death to our self-focused dreams, death to our possessions, death to our self-centered aspirations. We must take up our cross and follow him. For it is only in dying that we find life, true life, resurrection life. True life is only found through dying. This is the hinge that joins chapters 11 and 13, and it's the hinge that reveals Jesus' paradigm for ministry. So let's put these all together into this. Resurrection life requires walking the way of the cross. Let's say that again. Resurrection life requires walking the way of the cross. And if it means that if we're going to live like Jesus before the tomb of Lazarus, we must feel the pain of the people we seek to serve. We must feel their pain. And like Jesus rising to wash the disciples' feet, our acts of service must be driven by genuine, other-focused, cross-shaped love. Jesus would put it this way: "A new commandment I give to you, Love one another as I have loved you. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another. This love is to be the distinguishing mark of the followers of Jesus. It's not our theology, though that's important. It's not our position on social issues, though again, that's important. It's certainly not the grandeur of our facilities or the majesty of our cathedrals. It's not the beauty of our music or the size of our church. And it's definitely not the wealth that we so quickly label as the blessing of God. No, the distinguishing mark of the Christian and the church is love. Other-focused, cross-shaped love. It's to be the primary characteristic of our life together, and it is to be the shape of our engagement with the world. Now, in closing, I wish to offer this paradigm of service as a guide for how we as Christians in the church can engage with one of the most pressing issues facing our nation today. Over the last number of weeks, we Canadians have been deeply challenged by the discovery of unmarked graves and mass burial sites at residential schools across the country. We are a nation wrestling with history that's been laid before us, revealing the corruption and the brokenness and wickedness of a society directed at a community of people, Indigenous Canada. The history of the Canadian residential school system, it's an astonishing blemish on a society that wishes to present itself as polite, equitable, fair, and just. Now, the search for these graves is in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of 2015. It has been difficult, triggering sorrow and pain in Indigenous communities that are processing the last century plus of oppression and the impact it's had on their families, their communities, their culture. And it's been troubling for all Canadians, many of whom wonder, what can we do? Now, I don't pretend to have the answers to these complex challenges and the journey that is before Canada if it seeks to find healing with its Indigenous population and make peace with its past. But I do believe that the only way the church can meaningfully engage with this issue is to follow the paradigm of service that we see laid out here in John 11, 12, and 13. Following in the footsteps of Jesus, going where he goes, means we must face the brokenness head on. And the first thing we need to do is weep. Genuinely weep. For the suffering people at the hands of a broken world, we must weep. For the countless lives lost in residential schools, we must weep. For the communities decimated by the policies that formed residential schools that enabled families to be torn apart, we must weep. For the survivors who try to make sense of their losses and rebuild their sense of identity and humanity, we must weep. For the complicity of the church that 600 years ago blessed the violent displacement and enslavement of in lands European nations would encounter across the globe, we must weep. And for the twisted doctrine of the church that supported the construct of race, diminishing the humanity of Africans and Indigenous peoples, doctrines that infect the church to this very day. For this we must weep. And for the role of the church enacting government policy to forcefully assimilate Indigenous children stolen away from their homes and their communities, attempting to whitewash them into mainstream Canada and eliminate what church leaders and politicians alike called the Indian problem. We must weep. Any response by the church must start here. Like Jesus before the tomb of Lazarus, we must be touched in the deepest part of our being by the pain being experienced by Indigenous Canada and at the sinful system that enacted this cruelty. You know, there are many who would want to simply rush in the aid of Indigenous communities. And I understand this. I mean, I want to show the love of Christ too. And I want my church to embody the compassion and love of Christ. But if we don't weep first, if we don't feel the pain and understand the sorrow, there's no way we can properly serve. When Indigenous Canada looks at the church, what do they see? What do they encounter? I suggest to you that the message of the gospel will not be heard until the church weeps. For you see, people cannot hear the message of life and love in Jesus until we as Christians recognize the pain and suffering experienced by people, yes, at the hands of the church itself. Now, whether or not that was our church is not the point. For those who have experienced these things, the difference is inconsequential. So any response to the travesty of the historic oppression by the church must begin like Jesus before the tomb of Lazarus, feeling the pain, tasting the salt in the tears that are cried. And before taking up the towel to serve, it must be driven by an other-focused, cross-shaped, self-sacrificial love. Our God, He's not indifferent to the plight of the suffering and the oppressed in this world. And just as He joins in our suffering, He is to be found among the poor, the broken, and the oppressed. And so may we too be found where Jesus is. And may we discover, as we shape our lives by the cross of Jesus, as we embrace the suffering of the world as He did, and as we serve in genuine love, may we find that life, resurrection life, follows.